From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NoCo, a daily slice of Northern Colorado news and happenings. It's Friday, December 22nd. I'm Erin O'Toole. For many of us, the holidays are a time of gratitude, reflection, and gathering with loved ones. But let's face it, this time of year also can bring a ton of stress. If you're among the 60% of Coloradans traveling for the holidays, you're probably navigating congested roads or chaotic airports. Yeah, we're looking at UDIA and those 600,000 people expected to be in the TSA security lines. But here we are. You made it to your family's gathering. The wine is flowing like water, and now it's time to relax. But not so fast. Even in the kindest of families, dinner table discussions can sometimes turn into heated debate. And we've all got plenty of opinions, whether it's on the war in the Middle East, reproductive rights, or this week's Colorado Supreme Court decision that former President Donald Trump can't appear on our state's primary ballot. We're talking about a lot of potential flashpoints, but there is a ray of light here. With some thought and intention, your holiday conversations can be peaceful and maybe even bring people closer together.
So sometimes when you have a pretty good conversation with someone, the main thing you realize is, wait, we don't disagree nearly as much. There's still going to be disagreement. I'm not saying we're all going to agree, but normally the disagreement is much more manageable than we think it is when we have a good conversation. So that becomes the goal of it.
Martin Carcasson is a communications professor at Colorado State University. He's also the director of CSU's Center for Public Deliberation, where part of the curriculum is training people to foster civil and productive dialogue.
Don't have your goal to win or persuade. Don't even have your goal to come to consensus, right? Your goal is just to develop a little bit more understanding about each other.
Just in time for Christmas Eve gatherings, we're listening back to Martin's guidance on how to have healthier conversation at the dinner table. So I want to start with this idea of creating an atmosphere at the table where people can have interesting conversations about politics or whatever they want without anyone feeling attacked. And I think to really get at the heart of why this is so challenging, you sort of have to start with human nature, right? Because you've written about certain innate characteristics that we all have that maybe once were useful for human survival, but they now become a little bit problematic at the modern dinner table. Could you talk about one or two of these?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think probably the most relevant is our brains. Unfortunately, we're much more wired for simple stories, right? We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And once we decide who's playing what character, we kind of see the world through that lens. That leads to often kind of simplistic political positions and assumptions about what side's good and what side's evil. You make assumptions about motives of the other side, which kind of undermines our ability to kind of talk to each other and have these kind of tough conversations. And that certainly, those things can certainly kind of blow up a Thanksgiving table, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, with my family, and I'm sure this is the case with a lot of other families, sometimes it's just tempting if you're the host to want to either, have some pre-planned responses ready to go and then change the subject or just shut it all down preemptively. No election talk at the dinner table. But your work has shown that better listening can be a key to having a healthier conversation. Can you talk about some of the basics of good listening?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I think when you start understanding the social psychology and brain science, right, you understand that your brain is wired, that we naturally tend to focus on the upside of our position and the downside of opposing positions, right? Once you recognize that, I think it becomes easier to control. Right. So when we talk about listening, particularly talking to someone who disagrees with you, to see that as a learning opportunity, and that sets up a process to kind of have a conversation, right? That having that conversation and really asking them questions and being curious. Learning that also can set you up later on if you really do want to change your mind, right? Because you have to understand people from their perspective if you ever want to try to persuade them of anything.
Yeah, and you can't just try to persuade your uncle or your cousin of something over the salad and then bring them around to your point of view over dessert. You really have to take your time and think about listening to connect with them.
Yeah, as you know, we just had the conversation with the two governors that are part of this Argue Better process for the National Governors Association on campus here a couple of days ago. And Governor Cox from Utah kind of specifically and got it right? So that no one's ever been persuaded by being attacked. Our brains just don't work that way, right? And that taps into a different aspect of human nature of reciprocity, right? If you're giving someone the respect of listening to them and being curious, then they're going to give that back. And all of a sudden, we're kind of creating a positive feedback loop rather than the negative feedback loops that we get when we're screaming past each other.
Yeah, and we want to avoid that at the dinner table for sure. I wonder if you could touch on some of the quote unquote bad ways we listen to others. Because what I find sometimes in family conversations is, there's always one person who they look like they're listening, they're nodding their heads, but they're just thinking of how they're going to clap back.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from a former New York governor when we talk about listening. And the quote is like listening in the United States is a competitive exercise in which the first person to take a breath is deemed the listener, right? So often, normally we're listening to win, right? We're listening to find a flaw. We're listening to find an opening, right? We're listening for something that we can kind of undermine and kind of push back on. So when your brain's focused on that, you're not listening to connect. You're not listening to learn, which means you're not gathering those building blocks that are going to help you eventually if you really want to, listen to persuade or convince or kind of change someone's mind.
Well, I have to say, Martin, it can be really hard to sustain that open mind and that curiosity when you've got, that certain uncle that just will not stop with the conspiracy theories. And so why not just avoid interesting but potentially thorny conversation and just stick with the pleasantries along with the pumpkin pie,
Yeah, I mean, I actually have a mixed reaction to that, right? Yeah, you don't necessarily have to talk about politics if you're seeing a relative that you see kind of once a year and those type of things. Particularly if you don't feel comfortable doing it well. That's just going to make things worse in a sense. But obviously the stronger impulse for me is this realization that we have to learn how to have these conversations. People talk about, no, you can't talk about politics or religion at the kitchen table or whatever. That's people like. Every issue we deal with inherently involves all these underlining values. And the reality is most of us just avoid conflict. There's a few of us that love conflict and they tend to be pretty loud voices and like mixing things up. And there's a pretty small percentage of us that really know how to deal with conflict well. And I think what we really need to do as a community, and certainly this is part of what the CBD tries to do, is to grow that last third as much as possible. How do we build our skill set? So we're not just avoiding conflict and we're not just allowing the ones that love conflict to define the conversation, but we have more and more. We need more facilitators. We need more peacemakers. We need more bridge builders. And that's what's really going to help us, build the capacity in our communities and to deal with the outrage and polarization that's just kind of rampant right now, particularly at the national level.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I feel good about this. I feel inspired to try this. Hey, if it doesn't work, I'll just fall back on the, past the mashed potatoes. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
Martin Carcasson, thank you so much for talking with me about this today.
Yeah, thank you, Erin.
Martin shared a couple of resources, including a TED Talk on how to get along in a politically divided family. You'll find links in our show notes. That's it for us today here on In the NoCo. We'll be back with you next week to share some of our favorite episodes from this past year. Robin Vincent is our executive producer. I'm your host, Erin O'Toole. We wish you the happiest of holidays. We'll talk soon.